My name is Dorothy. I'm 75 years old, and I spent 40 years keeping the books for families and small businesses in Harlan, Kentucky. I know what a number means. I know what a date means. I know what a signature on a legal document means. And when my oldest son walked into that meeting with a folder in his hand and a practiced smile on his face, I knew exactly what every page inside it said before he opened his mouth. 3 weeks before that Tuesday afternoon, he had sat at my kitchen table, the same table where his father and I ate 31 years of Sunday dinners, and said to me, in that careful, measured tone he had been practicing for months, "You're not thinking straight anymore, Mom. We just want what's best for you." He said it looking at the wall just past my shoulder, the way people do when they have rehearsed something so many times they no longer need eye contact. I had heard that sentence 11 times before that day. I was keeping count. What he didn't know, and what my daughter Linda didn't know, and what Linda's husband Gary didn't know, was that 6 months before that meeting, I had walked into the office of my attorney, a man named Robert Calloway, who has practiced law in eastern Kentucky for 22 years, and I had handed him a folder of my own. Everything was already done. The neuropsychological evaluation, the new will, the legal notice, all of it dated, signed, and witnessed before they ever made their first phone call to a lawyer. When Robert sat down at that table and slid my folder across to them, I watched the color leave my son's face. Let me take you back to where this story begins. My husband Earl died on a Thursday morning in March, 3 years ago. He was 78. We had been married for 52 years. He used to say I was the mind behind everything, which was his quiet way of acknowledging that I handled every dollar that moved through our house from the day we got married. That was simply true. I had a head for numbers long before I made a career of it. In 1976, when I was 25 years old, I went to work for a small accounting firm in Harlan and stayed there for 4 decades. I kept the books for hardware stores and insurance offices and a lumber yard that had been in the same family since 1948. I balanced ledgers by hand before computers existed and learned the software when it arrived. I retired in 2016 at 67 years old with a clean record and a reputation I am proud of. I want you to understand what 40 years of bookkeeping actually means, because it matters to the rest of this story. It means that every error has consequences. It means that a figure written in haste and never checked will compound and distort until it corrupts everything built around it. It means you develop habits that become so natural they feel like breathing. You verify before you trust, you document before you forget. You never assume that what someone tells you verbally has the same weight as what you can hold in your hand and read yourself. Those habits did not retire when I did. I have 47 hardcover notebooks, black cover, college ruled, the kind you can still find at the drugstore on Market Street in Harlan. I started keeping them in 1977, the year after I began at the firm, because I believed then, and believe now, that if something matters, it deserves a written record. I record dates and amounts and names and conversations that felt significant enough to preserve. I note the weather sometimes, because context matters. I note who was in the room. I note what was left unsaid, which is often more important than what was spoken. Earl used to tease me about the notebooks. He would say, "Dorothy, you are going to outlive us all just by sheer documentation." He wasn't wrong about the documentation part. After Earl died, something shifted in the way Mitchell looked at me. It wasn't grief, or not only grief. Grief I understood. We were all grieving. It was something more deliberate, more considered, like a man who has been waiting for a particular moment to arrive and has already decided what he will do when it does. Within 6 weeks of the funeral, he had taken my car keys. Just temporarily, he said, while I was adjusting. I was adjusting fine. I had driven myself to the grocery store, the pharmacy, and church every week for 50 years. But I let it go. I was tired. Within 2 months of Earl's death, Mitchell had called my doctor, Dr. Patricia Norris, who I have seen for 14 years and who knows my health history better than I do, without my knowledge and without my consent, to ask whether I was managing. Dr. Norris told me about that call herself at my next appointment. She sat across from me in her office and said, "Dorothy, I want you to know someone called about you, and I want you to hear it from me directly." She told me his name and what he had asked. She was not pleased. Neither was I. I wrote it in my notebook when I got home. The date, the time, the exact words Dr. Norris used. In the 3 years since Earl passed, Mitchell and Linda had attended 2 of my doctor appointments without telling me they were coming. I let the first one go. I did not let the second one go. Dr. Norris and I agreed afterward that family members would attend only if I requested them myself. They had also walked through this house on 2 separate occasions, making notes on their phones about repairs and what they called safety concerns. They had spoken to someone at my bank, I discovered later, asking about options for managing accounts on behalf of an elderly parent. The bank employee they spoke to had the good sense to decline and to send me a letter informing me that an inquiry had been made. I have that letter still. It is paperclipped into Notebook 44. And they had suggested on 4 separate occasions that I might want to consider moving somewhere with more support. They never said nursing home. They always said somewhere with more support. There was a facility about 40 minutes from here. Very nice, Mitchell said, with activities and a dining room and people my own age. I said I had people my own age in Harlan. I said I was not interested in a dining room. I said I preferred my own kitchen, where I had cooked every meal in this house for 31 years, and where the smell of apple pie still meant something to me, and not just to my stomach. I wrote every conversation in my notebook, not because I was planning anything at the time, but because I am a bookkeeper. I record what happens. My youngest son, James, is 43. He runs a landscaping business out of Corbin, about an hour from Harlan, has a crew of 6 and more work than he can comfortably handle from April through October. He is not wealthy. He drives a truck that is older than his marriage, and he works in all weather, and he never once mentions it. Every Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, without exception, for the past 3 years, James has come to my kitchen table and had coffee with me. He has never missed a Tuesday. Not once. Not in 156 weeks since his father's funeral. He came when he had the flu and was running a low fever, and I made him sit far enough from me that I wouldn't catch it, and I brought him tea with honey instead of coffee. He came the morning after his truck broke down on the interstate, coming back from a job site in Barberville, because he had borrowed a truck from his foreman rather than miss our morning. He came when Thomas, his son, my grandson, was in the hospital with a broken arm. James called me from the waiting room while Thomas was getting his cast set, and we talked for 40 minutes about Earl, about the way Earl used to set Thomas on his knee and tell him stories, and James said he wanted Thomas to grow up knowing that memory. He came the following Tuesday morning with a paper bag of tomatoes from a client's garden. James never treated me like a problem to be managed. He asked my advice on business matters, on contracts, on a dispute he had with a client in early spring who refused to pay the final invoice on a retaining wall, claiming the materials were wrong. I looked at the contract language with him, and I told him exactly which clause applied and what his options were. He won that dispute. He sent me a card that said, "Mom, you should have charged me consulting fees." I laughed at that for 2 days. He is the reason I know what I know. On a Thursday afternoon in late April at 2:37, my phone rang. I know the exact time because I was sitting at the kitchen table with my notebook open, and I wrote the time before I answered. James's name was on the screen. He said, "Mom, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you not to react until I've finished." He had been at Mitchell's house for a family gathering the previous weekend, and he had overheard a conversation he was not meant to hear. He had stepped outside onto the back porch for some air, and Mitchell and Linda had been talking in the kitchen, not realizing the window was open. They had already met twice with an attorney who specialized in competency hearings and guardianship proceedings. They had gathered what they called documentation, which was the word that stopped me cold. because I understood immediately what that meant coming from my son, the architect, who does not use words loosely. They had a meeting scheduled, 3 weeks out. My living room, a Tuesday. James said, "Mom, I don't know what they have, but I wanted you to know." His voice was very steady and very careful, the way his voice gets when he is controlling something difficult. I thanked him. I told him I was fine. I told him not to worry. I told him I would call him soon. Then I sat with my notebook and wrote everything he had told me. Then I sat very still for about 10 minutes, looking at the photograph of Earl on the kitchen windowsill, the one from our anniversary trip to Gatlinburg in 2001. Earl squinting into the sun with his hand shading his eyes, and that particular smile he had, the one that meant he was about to say something that would make me laugh. Then I got up and made a cup of tea. The next morning, before I did anything else, I went to my kitchen table and opened the folder that Mitchell had left there the previous week. I had noticed it when he brought it. I had not opened it then because I was not ready. I opened it now. It contained a draft guardianship petition in my name. It listed what they were calling incidents, and the car situation was listed first, followed by what was described as episodes of confusion, which I did not recognize from my own life, and then notes from conversations I had never agreed to have recorded, including one from the call Mitchell had made to Dr. Norris's office, which Dr. Norris had declined to discuss with him, and which he had apparently summarized from his own interpretation of her tone. There was also the name and contact information of the attorney they were working with, a man in a Lexington firm that handled elder law and estate planning. I read every page. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Norris's office. I scheduled a neuropsychological evaluation, not a general wellness visit, not a memory screening, a full neuropsychological evaluation of the kind used in competency hearings, standardized tests measuring memory, executive function, language processing, sustained attention, processing speed, and reasoning. The kind administered by a psychologist with credentials the court would recognize, the kind that takes 4 hours and cannot be faked and cannot be dismissed. I had the evaluation done at a clinic in Lexington the following week. I drove myself. The psychologist who administered it was a woman named Dr. Susan Farley, who has a manner that is brisk and thorough and entirely without condescension, which I appreciated. She tested me for 4 hours on a Wednesday morning. She explained each section before we began and answered my questions about the scoring methods. When she reviewed my results with me in her office that afternoon, she said, "Mrs. Dorothy Whitfield, you are functioning at full cognitive capacity. Your scores across all measured domains are in the normal to superior range. In executive function and verbal reasoning specifically, your scores place you in the top 5% of your age group nationally." I wrote those words in my notebook in her office, in her presence, while she was still speaking. She didn't seem surprised. She said, "I see you take good notes." I said I had been doing it for 50 years. She asked if I wanted a copy of the full report, along with the summary. I said I wanted 3 copies. The second call was to Robert Calloway. Robert has been my attorney for over 20 years. He handled the purchase of this house in 1989, handled our wills the first time Earl and I wrote them in the 90s, handled Earl's estate when the time came. He is 61 years old, deliberate, composed, and not easily surprised by the things that people do to each other when money and property enter a conversation. I called him from the clinic parking lot in Lexington with the report in my lap and told him what was happening in plain language. He was not surprised. He said he had seen versions of this before and that we had several options. And then he asked me the question I keep returning to. "Dorothy, what outcome do you want? Not what do you want to prevent? What do you want to have when this is over?" I said I wanted 2 things. I wanted this house protected, and I wanted to be present at that meeting, not as a subject being discussed, but as a participant with standing. He said he could arrange both. We met on a Wednesday afternoon at 3:20 in his office on Mound Street. The room smelled of old paper and coffee and something like wood polish. I brought my notebooks. Not all 47, but the most recent 4, the ones covering the years since Earl died, with every date and every conversation recorded in my own handwriting. I rewrote my will that afternoon. This house, the house that Earl and I paid off in full in 1998, which a realtor told me last spring is worth approximately $285,000, along with the savings accounts, the certificates of deposit, his pension remainder, everything of substance went to James and to Thomas. Mitchell and Linda received the legal minimum required under Kentucky law, enough to show they had not been forgotten, not enough to reward what they had attempted. Robert also drafted a legal notice documenting the guardianship attempt and my response to it. He filed the neuropsychological report with the appropriate court as a preemptive record. And then I asked him to attend the meeting, without announcing himself in advance, without giving Mitchell and Linda the opportunity to prepare. He agreed. He said he would be there. He said, without any particular expression, that he had always enjoyed Tuesday afternoons. The weekend before the meeting, Thomas came to visit with his father on the regular Saturday drive. He is 8 years old and has his grandfather's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that Earl used to call storm weather eyes, the color of the sky over Black Mountain before a summer rain. He found me at the kitchen table with my notebook open, and he climbed into the chair across from me, the chair where his grandfather always sat, and propped his chin on his hands the way Earl used to do, and asked what I was writing. I said I was writing down the things that mattered, so I wouldn't forget them. He thought about that for a long moment, the way children do when they are taking something seriously. Then he said, "Grandma, do you write about me?" I said I wrote about him every single week. He sat up straighter when I said that, just a fraction, the way a child does when they discover they matter more than they thought they did. He asked if he could have a piece of apple pie. I had made it the day before, the recipe I had been making since 1974, thin sliced Granny Smiths with cinnamon and a pinch of nutmeg, and the butter crust that takes 20 minutes to make properly, but is worth every one of those minutes. I gave him the last piece and sat across from him and watched him eat it at the table where his grandfather used to sit, with that same concentrated pleasure. 4 days before the meeting. I want to ask you something before I tell you what happened in that room. If your family had treated you as though getting older meant your mind had stopped working, as though the person who raised them and kept the household running and made every significant financial decision for 5 decades had simply ceased to be a reliable witness to her own life, what would you have done? Would you have warned them first? Confronted them? Given them the chance to stop? I had thought about that. I had thought about it carefully and at length over the weeks between James's phone call and the meeting. I am not a person who acts from anger, not because I don't feel it, but because I have learned that anger makes you imprecise, and imprecision is expensive. I decided I would not warn them, not out of cruelty, not out of revenge in any dramatic sense, but because they had made their plans in silence. They had gathered their documentation and consulted their attorney and scheduled their meeting without once saying to me directly, "Mom, we are worried about this specific thing, and we would like to discuss it with you." They had not extended that courtesy to me. I would not extend it to them. We would all learn what the other had prepared at the same time, sitting at a table, reading documents. The meeting was on a Tuesday. They had chosen a Tuesday, I think, partly because it was the day James came to see me every week, and he would already have left by 2 in the afternoon. He was not invited. I had not told him what I had arranged because I did not want him to carry the weight of it. He had done his part when he made that phone call in April. I arrived in my own living room at 1:55. I set my notebook on my lap, and I waited. The chairs had been rearranged around the coffee table. 4 of them. Mitchell, Linda, Gary, and the attorney they had hired, a younger man with a briefcase, who had the expression of someone doing a familiar job without particular feeling about it. They had arranged the space as though they were conducting a meeting, which they were. They had simply not accounted for the possibility that I would conduct one too. There was no chair for me. I went to the dining room and brought one myself. I set it at the head of the arrangement, the position that faced all four of them. I sat down. I folded my hands on my notebook. I looked at my son. He looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Robert came through the front door at 1:58 and sat in the chair nearest the door without greeting anyone. Mitchell looked at him and then looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was about 12 years old and had done something he knew was wrong and was calculating whether I already knew. I said simply, "He's with me." That was all I said. Mitchell began. He had clearly prepared, practiced even. He talked about concern and love and the family wanting to make sure I was protected during what he called a difficult chapter. He used the word trajectory, which I noted. He listed the incidents, the car, the appointments, the concerns about the house. He talked about the responsibility they felt as my children to ensure I had the right support. And then he said the words, "Mom, you're not thinking straight anymore. We just want what's best for you." The 12th time. I know it was the 12th time because I had written down each of the previous 11 in my notebook with the date and the context, and I had counted them that morning while I was having my coffee. He had his folder open on the coffee table. He was on the 4th page of the guardianship petition. Robert reached into his briefcase without hurrying. He set my folder on the coffee table and slid it across to Mitchell with one hand. The top page was Dr. Susan Farley's neuropsychological evaluation summary. Full cognitive capacity, top 5% nationally, dated 2.5 weeks before this meeting. Mitchell looked at it. He looked at Robert. He looked at me. I said nothing. Robert spoke quietly and without emphasis, the way a person speaks when the facts themselves are the argument. He said that I had retained his services approximately 6 months ago, that all documents in the folder had been prepared and executed and witnessed before any meeting between my children and their attorney had been scheduled, and that the guardianship petition, if filed with the court, would be met with the neuropsychological report, the legal notice he had filed, and the written statement that Dr. Norris had agreed to provide on my behalf regarding my cognitive and medical status over the 14 years she had been my physician. Then he slid the 2nd page across, the legal notice, documenting the attempt and my response to it. Then the 3rd page, which was the signature page of the new will, with my signature, the notary seal, and the date, a Wednesday, 3:20 in the afternoon. The house was already in James's name. Not mine, not Mitchell's, not subject to any guardianship claim or estate dispute. Recorded and filed at the Harlan County Courthouse before any of the 4 people sitting in front of me had entered my living room. Mitchell's attorney looked at the documents for a long time. Then he closed his briefcase. He said something quietly to Mitchell that I could not hear from where I was sitting. He said something else. Mitchell's face had gone the color of old plaster. Linda was looking at the floor. Gary was very still. I waited until the room was quiet. Not performing quiet, actually quiet. The way a room gets when the thing that needed to happen has happened, and everything else is just aftermath. Then I said, "I know what's best for me, son. I always have." That was the meeting. The guardianship petition was never filed. By the following Sunday, the Harlan Baptist congregation was aware. 3 women from my Sunday school class came to sit with me at coffee hour. By the week after that, I had heard at least 3 different versions of Mitchell's explanation for why the meeting had gone the way it went. In one version, it had all been a misunderstanding. In another, they had decided on their own I was doing fine. In the third, which reached me secondhand through a woman I've known since our children were in elementary school together, Mitchell had simply decided that Mom was sharper than they'd realized. That last version was the most accurate, and also my favorite. Mitchell called me on a Saturday morning, 10 days after the meeting. He called at 8:45, which I know because I was still having my first cup of coffee. He said he was sorry. He said he had been genuinely frightened, that after his father died, he had started seeing me slow down in ways he couldn't name, and that the fear had become something else, something he wasn't proud of. He mentioned pressure at work, a project that had gone over budget. And I heard in that a part of the story he probably still won't tell me directly. He said he knew he had hurt me. He cried, which was the first time since the morning of his father's funeral, when he had stood in this kitchen with the specific grief of a man who has lost his father and has not yet figured out who he is without him. I listened to all of it. I said, "Mitchell, you are my son, and you are welcome in this house. You always will be. But the decisions in this house are mine. They always were." He said he understood. I told him to come for Sunday dinner. He did. He brought apple pie from the bakery on Pine Mountain Road, which was not as good as mine, but was a sincere gesture, and I accepted it as such. We have not spoken about the meeting since that phone call. Some things do not need to be revisited once they have been settled. Thomas came back the weekend after everything was over, with James for their regular Saturday visit. He was in the garden with me in the late morning, helping me stake the tomato plants the way his grandfather used to do, planting the wooden stakes carefully and tying the stems with strips of old cotton that Earl had saved in a coffee can in the garage, a can that is still there, still half full, that I cannot quite bring myself to throw away. Thomas set down the stake he was holding at one point and put his arms around me, around my middle, the full-body hug that children do when they are not thinking about the gesture, but simply doing it. I hugged him back. We stood in the garden for a moment in the early June light, the kind of light that comes through the oak leaves soft and green and unhurried, the kind that makes the garden look the way it did when the children were small and Earl was alive and this yard was full of noise. I want to say something directly to anyone listening who has ever been in a room where your age was being used against you. Being old is not the same as being finished. 75 years is not a diagnosis. I spent 40 years never letting a single error go uncorrected, in a ledger, not one error in 4 decades, because I understood that a mistake left alone does not stay small. I brought that understanding into the rest of my life. I documented, I verified, I did not assume goodwill where goodwill had not been demonstrated. And when the moment came that required me to act, I acted precisely and without panic, because I had been preparing, in one way or another, since 1977. I won because James picked up the phone. I won because Dr. Norris told me the truth about that phone call. I won because Robert Calloway asked me the right question, and I knew the answer. I won because I went to the dining room and brought my own chair to the table. Being old is not being disposable. It never was, and it never will be. I have 47 notebooks that prove it. Now, I want to ask you something before we close. Have you ever had a family member treat you as though your age meant your judgment was no longer worth consulting? Or have you watched it happen to someone you love, someone capable and present and aware, and felt the helplessness of not knowing what to say? Leave a comment and tell me. I read every one. And wherever you are watching this from, your kitchen, your living room, a quiet moment at the end of a long day, I am glad you are here. Thank you for listening to Dorothy Whitfield.